Speaker.
Matt Toosey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. An honour and pleasure to rise in speaking in support of the second reading of the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board Empowering Bill. Just to pick up where that last member left off, I'm hoping we're not sounding like we're giving sermons, but rather debating and talking to the issues at hand. There's probably several members that probably claim to know what it's like to do the work of God, but I very much, it's great to stand here in support of a worthy cause. I just want to acknowledge that I haven't been in the Select Committee process and not been a member of the Government Administration Select Committee. But first, just to acknowledge the Honourable Dr. Nick Smith as a private member's bill private bill that he has brought here, and also the Honourable Ruth Dyson as the chairperson, a fellow Canterbury MP who's done well shepherding this bill through the legislative process. There's also a couple of other Select Committee members, Brett Hudson and Sarah Dowie, that I'd like to acknowledge for their hard work. Obviously two strong MPs for the class of 2014 who are doing some great work on the Government Administration Select Committee. So I had a look at this bill, Mr. Speaker, and for me, really, the bill is about change, and it's facilitating that change for this organisation, the Christian Churches. And actually, there's a few background points I want to put on record, and it's no surprise that this church seems to take the lead in change. When you look at the background of this church, they are pretty much a globalised network. They operate in about 185 countries. But when you trace back the history, the UK, United States, very much around the Enlightenment period. And when you think about what the Enlightenment period was, it was a movement where people moved away around the control and conformity of religion and moved to a more rational base outview on life around science. And we all know the astronomer and scientist Copernicus at that time, who proved that the Earth wasn't the centre of the universe, it was the sun, and the Earth moved around it. And why that's important to this bill is that if they can trace their history to the Enlightenment period, it shows their ability to move through different phases and to change. And that's what they've identified in this bill, is that the current legislation, the current structure of the board is now needing a change to drive the Christian churches forward. So I thought that's very important, Mr. Speaker. It's predominantly based on change. And what we know with this organisation, as it focuses possibly less on bricks and mortar and moves out to its outreach approach and supports people in the communities that it serves. I suppose I know I've been brought up in somewhat the Christian faith and understanding the ambition as well of getting out and serving the people. And I think, Mr. Speaker, it's only right that we're supporting this legislation to go through and help the Christian churches. It was also interesting when you look at the history of the Christian churches in New Zealand, coming over about the Treaty of Waitangi time. And I noticed, being a Christchurch-based MP, it said they arrived around in 1870 and set up in Christchurch. And it's great to hear the stories about the rich tapestry of history that the Christian churches brought to a city like Christchurch. I mean, we have been claimed to be the most English city outside of England. And a few days ago, Mr. Speaker, in my electorate of Waimakariri, I went to the Woodend Pegasus Anglican Church. It was the induction of a new vicar. And when you stand in that church and you take in the art and the tapestry and the culture of those organisations that have been around for a very long time, but also appreciate the people that have been in that church and the sense of community, the sense of wanting to go out and make a difference in other people's lives. And I think that's probably why the MPs around this House can relate to this bill, Mr. Speaker, because it's about an organisation that wants to make a change in people's lives. So we can see that the legislation contained a provision defining the trusts upon which the board was to hold real estate and personal property vested in it. And that's very much the crux of this legislation and the bill. So we know that in the Select Committee process there was only 2 submissions. And one of those submissions was made by the Christian churches itself, the Associated Churches of Christchurch Extension and Property Trust Board Property Trust. And what they went on to do is do a bit of a cost-benefit analysis of looking at different options of how they'd like to move in a board structure. So they looked at retaining the status quo. And what they said in that, Mr. Speaker, the board concluded that the constraints imposed by the 1929 Act were significant, and the benefits of increased and more flexible powers in respect of the use of the funds, both capital and income, well outweighed any costs of seeking to change. And I suppose that comes back to the point around change. We're moving away from the bricks and mortar and understanding how they best can use their resources to serve their communities they're in. Because when you look at the range of locations that they're at, there is quite a number. I did notice they weren't in the Waimakere area though, so I'd urge them, as the third fastest growing electorate and the third biggest district in the South Island, that it would be a place of growth to come to as well. But when you look at the option 2 they provided around new property trust board, they explored the options for the select committee there. And I think this is why it was helpful, the select committee, to understand how they'd landed with the proposed bill. But finally they landed, Mr. Speaker, on option 3 around the charitable trust. And they go on to say a more modern charitable trust concept was considered to provide the best vehicle for the trust board to be able to operate efficiently and meaningfully in 2015 and beyond. And I just follow on, Mr. Speaker, from Mr. O'Rourke, as a Canterbury-based MP, reference the earthquakes. And I've seen, I suppose we see the parallels in this change of legislation to reflect the needs of the Christian churches, just like as a city of Christchurch, the change in the legislation as well to support it to grow, but ultimately to go out and connect with the people that the organisation is trying to support and make a difference in our lives. And we see that whether it be healthcare services or social care services, but in the case of Christian churches, it's around pastoral services and how they can go out and capture those resources. Because currently, under the old legislation that this new legislation will repeal and amend, it only allows for the resources to be spent on real estate. And with this new bill, it will allow the Christian churches and the board to then make decisions not only on real estate, but how they can allocate their resources accordingly to the needs of the communities they are serving. One thing I just wanted to touch on, Mr. Speaker, was also to finish on was really the acknowledgement of what they've done not only in New Zealand. I noticed in their backing notes that they have churches over in Zimbabwe, and the support that they've done over in third world countries I think needs to be acknowledged as well. So overall, Mr. Speaker, I think it's fair to say by the support around the House that this bill is well supported. It's a well-intended bill that ultimately is about change, and what we're doing here is supporting a traditional, a historic organisation like the Christian churches, allow them to think forward about how best serve their needs and their parishioners. And it's great that Parliament and this chamber and all MPs around this House are able to facilitate that and support them. So I commend this private bill in its second reading to the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.